the long-term real price of all commodities is lower, and don't fall for, people who are out there thinking that the sky is falling, ironically, But yeah, that's the key message. If you have to invest in energy or commodities, invest in companies that are leveraged to volume, not price, and you'll do much better. But by and large, there's lots of oil in the world, there's lots of gas in the world, and there's only going to be more of it as technology evolves.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the WTFinance podcast. On this episode, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Doomberg. So Doomberg, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast today.
It's great to be with you again, my friend.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I think you're one of our most popular guests. You've probably been on the most as well. I think it's 7 or 8 times now. So everyone's really interested in what you have to hear. So I'm sure they'd be really interested in hearing more about what you're currently seeing in the economy and markets at the moment.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating time to be chronicling the markets. Obviously, the crypto tech sell-off seems to have been at least partially stunted by NVIDIA's, as the market at least judges them, fantastic results announced yesterday. The thing that's probably breaking the fastest that is on our radar as it pertains to sort of the energy markets and geopolitics, of course, is the developing situation in Ukraine. Globally, energy markets are pretty well balanced, and if a deal is struck between the US and Russia, that will have global ramifications. Hard to tell the signal from the noise with all of the propaganda floating around out there. So, happy to take it in any of the directions that you'd like to go.
Yeah, great. It'd be interesting to hear, if there were to be, or what likelihood do you put on sort of Ukraine-Russia ceasefire, and what impact do you see that having on
that
markets?
That war has to come to an end. The situation in Ukraine heading into this winter is quite dire. The Ukrainians are out of money, and Europe doesn't seem to have the political will to paper over the $50 to $60 billion a year hole that has been left when President Trump decided to stop funding the war, which I think was a very important decision that sort of led to where we are today. The Zelensky government seems to be falling apart at the moment. There's lots of allegations of corruption. When we saw the NABU corruption raid on Zelensky's inner circle that happened last week, our immediate conclusion was Trump wants Zelensky out. That was clearly a U.S. effort. We started to see ministers flee the country. And I think this recent sort of story that first broke in Axios and then was reported on in Politico, which of course are two news sources that you always have to take with a grain of salt. There seems to be something large afoot. And if you believe how things were described by Politico, and again, rarely do, but just to sort of bring the audience up to speed with what's being whispered about. There's 4 parts to the deal between the U.S. and Russia. Settling the land dispute between Russia and Ukraine is just one part of that deal. The deal is also meant to settle sort of security across all of Europe, including Russia. So a grander bargain perhaps has been negotiated behind the scenes. And then I think the part that Trump will leap on is resetting the economic relationship between the United States and Russia. The Europeans are howling, and especially the British press. And so that tells us that something is near. I think long-term, Russia and the US collaborating would have huge ramifications across multiple supply chains, not the least of which would be energy. And I think in the early phases of such a deal, assuming it gets done, we would expect to see significant headwinds to the price of energy. Once the friction that has been artificially imputed into the oil and gas supply chains around the world is removed, because we're assuming that sanctions relief would be a significant part of this deal, then that's why it's so important that we keep an eye on it, because I think it's got to be worth $10 a barrel less than we're currently trading, I would guess. And then that just opens up an enormous arc of investment between the two countries as well. Now, all this might sound weird to people who are only consuming their news from legacy media outlets, especially those, say, living in Britain or Europe. But our view is that's the grand deal that was verbally agreed to in Anchorage. Something happened after Anchorage, namely the Europeans and the Ukrainians did their best to scuttle the deal. But with the move against Zelensky, that tells us that Trump is probably done. And if you listen to some of the quoted, again, you always have to be careful. People familiar with the matter, they quoted one administration official saying, "We don't really care what Europe thinks. This is about making Ukraine accept the terms." So it'll be extraordinarily controversial. It'll come as a shock to many people in Europe and Western Europe in particular, who have been told a wholly different story than the reality on the ground for many, many years now. But that's where we think things are going.
Yeah, really interesting. And what do you think is the driver of Trump and I guess his administration looking for this ceasefire versus, I guess it's very different to what Biden was looking for previously?
Well, I mean, our view is the war is lost. The U.S. is dangerously low on many weapons systems. Hundreds of billions have been poured into the war. Russia is successfully fighting a grinding war of attrition. The situation on the battlefield has turned against Ukraine substantially in the past few weeks. And sometimes in life, you just have to take the L. And I think Trump, if he had his way, would have negotiated this deal much, much earlier in his presidency. He's facing significant political backlash from the Forever War Party in D.C. and the European elite in Brussels and London. But ultimately, he is the president of the United States. And when you, as Secretary Rubio sort of shockingly admitted, again another underreported story, he admitted two things in a recent press briefing. One was that there's nothing left for the U.S. to sanction. In other words, the sanctions war has been lost. And the other is that there's no use in sending Patriot missile systems to Ukraine because they're destroyed within a week of getting set up. That's a pretty amazing thing for the U.S. Secretary of State to casually admit. And this is something we've known because we follow the war very closely. You can see in the open source, a Russian drone spots a Patriot missile delivery system, gives the coordinates to a targeted missile, Iskander or something like that. And then next thing you know, that same drone films footage of the Patriot missile system being destroyed. These are very expensive. Each missile alone is like $1 million a pop. And beyond that, Russian drone technology, in collaboration undoubtedly with the Chinese and the North Koreans, is just overwhelmed Ukraine's air defense system. And finally, in what we believe is a war crime, Russia has systematically targeted and destroyed much of Ukraine's electricity generation and hot water generation potential just as Ukraine heads into the winter on a scale that has not yet been seen before in the war. And then finally, we see an awful lot of hype around Ukraine's sustained attack on Russia's refining complex. We wouldn't put those two things on the same scale. Russia has a vast crude oil production and refining infrastructure. When we look at the markets, we don't see much in the way of a response to those activities. That's the kind of thing, if it were having a real effect, you'd see it. There's certain tightness in some refined products in some areas of the world, but it's nowhere near at the scale that it will affect Russian civilian life or Russia's military, like the attack on the Ukrainian electricity and thermal grids is going to have. And so at some point, you have to recognize reality for what it is. And as Senator Rubio tweeted, I believe just last night, like sometimes you have to end a war as messy and as complicated and frankly as lost as this, you have to make difficult concessions. The alternative is that the war will end militarily, and worse outcome for Ukraine will be enforced at the end of a barrel. And so we think just as winter arrives, the sudden arrival of a corruption scandal that is just universally covered by all the outlets that were telling us how wonderful everything is in Ukraine over the past 4 years. All of a sudden, if you just type in, Zelensky corruption, every single Western legacy media outlet is running it, front page above the fold, that's a pretty strong sign that there's a major shift occurring.
Yeah, interesting. It does seem that the refinery margins have been quite a lot higher than the historical norm over the past 10 years. So I'm not sure if that's also to do with some of the other refining sort of producers coming online haven't been running very well.
Well, I mean, if you just take a step back, what's happening here? If you attack a refinery, what happens? Well, the price of crude oil goes down, all else being equal, because there's less demand for crude if you take out a refinery. And then the remaining refiners get to pay less for their crude than they otherwise would, and get to charge more for their products than they otherwise would, because that refiner went down. So that's sort of the natural consequence. And so, like, again, we're not arguing that we're not seeing some indications in the charts that we follow that the fact that Russia is slowing its exports of refined products to feed its domestic industry and military industrial complex as a priority. There's certainly evidence that these attacks are indeed occurring. There's film evidence, we see them. There's some market response to it, but it's nowhere near, say, the energy crisis of 21 or 22. And so I just don't think you can compare the two. By the way, we're firmly against the wanton destruction of energy assets, Nord Stream, Ukraine's grid. These are, yes, they are important for the military, but like Ukraine, if these attacks keep up, would be unlivable this winter. You couldn't live in Kiev this winter. And that's a huge toll on citizen non-combatants. I mean, this is why we would call it a war crime. But again, as we've often said, the phrase war crime is oxymoronic because all wars are crimes in our view, which is why we're so firmly opposed to them.
Okay, interesting. But so it seems like you think this would have quite a negative impact on the price of oil if there were to be a ceasefire. Well, how about gas as well? Because I feel like that's a little bit different because there seems to be an unwillingness of Europe to potentially buy Russian gas in the future. So it might take a little bit longer for them to build the infrastructure.
When we say Europe, we have to be mindful of the fact that what we really mean is the current batch of leaders who are wildly unpopular and unlikely to survive what will be seen as a capitulation to Russia. So just because Ursula von der Leyen or Friedrich Merz or Macron or Keir Starmer are continuing to shun your Russian energy doesn't mean that whoever replaces these wildly unpopular leaders won't have a different view. What will then matter more is whether Russia is actually willing to sell Europe oil and gas after this whole affair. That is, in fact, the question that's top of our mind. Don't forget, they're building Power Siberia 2. That's going to take a third of what was going to Europe and send it to China instead. So yeah, I mean, the post-war global order is going to be so profoundly different than what we've seen in the past 5 years that it's actually pretty difficult to model how profound, if the deal is described by Politico, is actually implemented. And there's serious chances that it won't be. That is a profound game-changing reorientation of the global power structure, and it's impossible that won't significantly impact the energy markets.
Yeah, really interesting. So I know there's sort of, if we look into the next half of first half of 2026, there's going to be quite a lot of supply coming online, especially non-OPEC supply, potentially pushing oil prices down even further. Do you see that going down to $40? Do you see it going down lower? How are you seeing this dynamic?
Well, our equilibrium price for oil is $55 a barrel, and that's based on our equilibrium price of landed LNG in Europe being $10 per million BTU. And if you just sort of correct for energy, it comes up to around $56, $57 a barrel. We're pretty close to equilibrium price today, but there's so much oil in the world. We're contemplating writing a piece, which is probably the rest of my day's work when I hang up with you, tentatively titled "Cup Runneth Over." If you just look at what Exxon announced recently, a huge proppant breakthrough using basically cheap byproduct from its refineries, modified petroleum coke, and they see a 20% boost in production in the Permian, and they're going to spread it to basically all their wells. Technology is just a grinding disinflationary force, which is why we always say that the long-term price of all commodities, at least the long-term real price of all commodities, is lower. And look, we're just running some numbers, looking through the statistical review of World Energy's invaluable spreadsheet. Like 4 million barrels of oil per day were burned to produce electricity in 2024. And half of that number was in the Middle East, which is drowning in natural gas that it could produce and shut down these oil burning plants and, fire up a gas turbine burning plant. And so there's like that extra slack in the market that people don't really consider. Of course, that number has been coming down, but still 4 million barrels a day of oil being burned to produce electricity in places like Saudi Arabia. And, there's no reason why they can't build a nuclear power plant to displace that or a natural gas facility to displace that. And then when you just look at the huge potential of the Western Hemisphere, which we think will be the next phase of World War III, we're putting together our November Doom Zoom presentation, just about ready to record it over the weekend. And the title is World War III, How We Got Here and Where We're Going. And the back half of that presentation will be what we think is going to happen in the Western Hemisphere. And if, from Mexico down to Argentina, there's 10 million barrels a day of incremental capacity waiting to be developed. So there's way more than enough oil. The whole concept of cheap oil has always been a myth, something we have hopefully steered our subscribers away from indulging in such fantasies, because that's what they are. But here we are, roughly at the equilibrium price we've been calling for a long time. And if the war does end, it is pretty bearish for oil, because embedded within the current price is all manner of artificial frictions that have arisen from the whole sanctions regime. And so if you make it easier for product to come to market, which is what we've been arguing should have been the strategy since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, instead of sanctioning volume, the US Navy should be escorting every Russian tanker filled with oil, and we should not be having US proxies blow up Russian refineries, because the whole way to win a sanctions war against Russia is to flood the world with energy, drive the prices down so that Russia doesn't profit from its massive commodity infrastructure. When you try to sanction volume, you make prices higher than they artificially would be. And so, I think, again, total game changer if this deal happens anywhere near the way it's being described.
Yeah, I think with commodities, and you could say with refining and with chemicals, that there is this shift away from maybe market dynamics to a more strategic, potentially protectionist mechanism of maybe you want to make sure you have supply for your own production in case there's any cutoffs with the global market. So it seems like there's almost like some of these industries aren't as price sensitive as the past. There's willing to take losses for longer because of this potential geopolitical concerns and the need for security.
Sure. We wrote a piece recently called Talib's Law where we talked about this. Look, in 5 years, you're not going to be able to give away rare earths. I mean, all shortages lead to gluts. And one thing that Western financial markets are particularly poor at doing is discounting national security, appraising the value of national security correctly in real time. And so what happened is the West allowed China to accumulate significant control over critical minerals. China used that leverage in the economic part of World War III successfully, and this is causing a global stampede to rebuild what had been outsourced because of NIMBYism, a whole mining and processing infrastructure across multiple metals. That's all fine and good for the companies that are getting huge run-ups in their stock price now. But when everybody turns on all their new rare earth facilities all at once, what's going to happen to the price? Now, the government will put a floor under the rare earth that it needs to acquire for its military-industrial complex, and that might be fine. But like the global markets for this stuff are going to tank. All shortages are followed by gluts, and this is sort of a universal truism of economics. And the reason why we call it Talib's Law is because that brilliant insight was something that we learned from Nassim Taleb in a wonderful tweet that he put out during the height of the energy crisis of 21, 22. And we've been extending this sort of mental model to even, the US dollar and payment rails and things like that. Like when you sanction, you create artificial shortages, and what happens on the back end is when people create their workarounds, you have a glut of payment rails and different ways to do business. And I think we're seeing that now with global adoption of Alipay as a commercial payment rail that is completely outside of the US dollar financial system. So all shortages create gluts, and we're at the glut phase for sure of many of the shortages that were lit when the war in Ukraine went hot.
Okay, interesting. And I guess that's going into LNG and sort of gas. And, I know you've talked a lot about the US Gulf Coast and the sort of the implementation of a lot of those LNG facilities. And I guess also the rise in demand of AI in the US. So how do you see that market sort of evolving?
Sure.
Is there a risk that it seems like some of those LNG terminals might not be economic if Henry Hub rises higher than sort of the global markets?
Well, there's so much natural gas in that area. So again, it's always cyclical, right? So what happens is price gets high because there's a shortage, either because of a shortage of production or an unexpected surge in demand. And then producers overreact. And in a world, by the way, where natural gas gets expensive in the US, that's also very bearish for oil because of co-production economics, which is a fundamental shift in the way the oil and gas markets work. The largest producer of both oil and gas, more often than not, produces them both at the same time. And so if gas becomes really expensive, you might drill for more and more gas, and the associated oil that you get, you give that away instead of giving away the natural gas. So in the Permian right now, natural gas is a nuisance, and it often has, spot prices that are negative. They pay people to take it, at least spot. And so that's because oil prices were high for so long, and they still have this mindset of being, an oil first, drilling rig. But in the Permian, if natural gas were to be, sustainably above $4, $5, $6 a barrel, sorry, $4 or $5 or $6 per million BTU, which is, a pretty low price from an energy perspective. That's $30 a barrel oil, $25 a barrel oil. They would be drilling for gas like you wouldn't believe it. So when people say, what is the break-even price of oil production in the Permian? That's actually an incorrect question to ask. You have to ask, what is the combined price of oil and natural gas that makes it a break-even to co-produce these two products out of the same wells? And so what we will see in the scenario of high AI demand growth, we should see a bid under natural gas that induces more supply. And when that happens, we'll get more oil as a byproduct. And so that's, again, so the long-term price of the long-term real price of all commodities is just lower. It just is. That's hard for people to understand, but buying the commodities themselves is like buying the VIX. You're just going to get ground down. Every once in a while, you'll see a spike, but then, much better to fade those spikes than to try to time them.
Yeah, okay, great point. And so you think no matter, despite the potential massive demand in AI, there's just enough gas to go around.
This is a point that we've been banging the drum on for a couple of years now. We did a piece called Gas Arithmetic. No, like the Permian is not going to roll over. There's not going to be the geology will not impede the gas market from meeting any incremental demand that you might envision appearing in the future. There's just like in the Permian, everyone talks about the Permian. There's a huge traditional natural gas field in the Permian that's just untapped. Because why? Why would you drill for natural gas alone when you could get it for $1 a million BTU, $2 a million BTU, as much as your heart's content? This is why we're seeing all of these data centers being built in West Texas. It's no surprise. We wrote a piece, I think probably 18 months ago, called Bridge Burning, where we predicted that natural gas would be the bridging fuel to a nuclear renaissance to power AI. Once you understand the physics of things, you can make those types of predictions with confidence. And so there's just so much gas, and this has changed things. It has altered the global energy landscape in ways that people who would like the price of oil to go higher are either blind to, or their biases don't allow them to see it for what it is.
Yeah, and I think we're even seeing some data centers actually buying their own gas turbines, and
Yeah.
As you said, going near those fields, not even connected to the grid because it takes too long. They just sort of.
Oh, yeah. We wrote a piece, again, not because this is all we do. If something is interesting, we write about it. We wrote a piece called Irreconcilable Differences that predicted that. Yeah, you would have natural gas going in one side of the building and data coming out the other. It's much easier to move, data around the world than it is to move natural gas. And beyond that, we also predicted that countries like Malaysia and Qatar would become AI data center hotspots because they have gas there that they normally freeze and put it on a boat. Well, why don't you just intercept it before paying all the expense to freeze it? So this is why Europe won't be an AI power center, because it needs LNG to run their data centers, whereas in the Permian or in Western Canada or in Malaysia or in Qatar, Russia, where there's an infinite supply of natural gas, you build it there. This is why China's dependency on coal is going to be so hard for them to shake, because they don't have huge amounts of natural gas. They have to rely on burning coal, and that's why they burn 55% of the world's coal, because that's relatively cheap, cheap way to power their electricity grids. So yeah, this is, again, if you're looking for an edge, in your investing or trading, physics is a pretty good one.
Yeah, definitely. China has surprisingly been able to sort of increase their gas production quite a lot, but you don't see that being a continuous trend. So, yeah,
They're still, like, when you look at the regions, and I could pull up the data here for you in a second. China is a huge net importer of hydrocarbons, and they have to paper that over with coal. And I've got the numbers right here. So just because it's a chart in our latest. So in 2024, China consumed 140 exajoules of hydrocarbons, coal, gas, and oil, and only produced 111. So they have like a 29 exajoule deficit in their hydrocarbon production. By comparison, North America, which is Canada, US, and Mexico, has a surplus of 17 exajoules. And Russia has a surplus of 24 exajoules. The Middle East has a surplus of 42 exajoules. So when you just look at the supply-demand scenarios, China has a lot of catching up to do, both in gas and oil, before it closes that gap, and long before it will ever be able to slow down its burning of coal. Anytime we see these crazy stories about how China's going renewable and their days of burning coal are over, it's crazy. As we wrote in a piece here recently, China burns an enormous amount of coal to make oil products. That's one of the ways they're trying to close their vulnerability. Coal to chemicals is just exploding in China. They expect it to double from here. They're making natural gas from coal. We showed in the piece that if the plans as described, they'll end up producing 1.9 BCF per day of natural gas from coal, which is roughly the size of LNG Canada. And so, of course, China's not going to get off coal. Like, again, physics dictates geopolitics as well.
Yeah, and I heard they brought, I don't know if it's last year, but as a fact I saw they brought on more coal production than the whole of the US has combined sort of last year or something like that. So there's sort of a everything all at once energy increase.
But the pretty pictures of solar arrays are a cloak for coal burning. Like, let's call it what it is.
Yeah, exactly. That's how they produce it. I'm not sure there's something where you go into, but if we look at, I guess, energy prices have gone down quite a lot, but a lot of the actual energy stocks have remained quite resilient and is sort of closer to all-time highs. So there's almost been a disconnect between sort of the oil price and their stock prices. I don't know if that's something you looked at, or if you have a theory of why that could be the case.
Well, we don't study the individual stock markets all that closely, the stocks of individual oil and gas companies all that closely. But broadly speaking, during Republican administrations, the oil and gas companies get to build stuff and they get to make a lot more money. During Democratic administrations. And so, but there's just a general buoyancy in the stock market, one. And two, because of Trump's relentless dismantling of the climate agenda, we think that these companies are becoming more investable, sort of institutionally. And it's okay to own dirty fossil fuel companies in your portfolio again. So it might be some combination of those two things, if I had to take a stab at explaining it.
Okay, very interesting. But yeah, it looks like you talked about AI, and I guess the fact that energy producing countries are going to really benefit in the coming years economically from the AI and that increasing use of energy. So I imagine you think they're going to be the greatest beneficiaries in the coming years of economically. And so Europe's sort of screwed, basically.
Europe is very screwed, and especially post-war, when the propaganda cloak gets removed, there's going to be political upheaval in Europe, for sure. The current class of leaders will not be able to withstand anywhere near the deal that is being rumored that Trump and Putin are working out. And so there will be political upheaval all across Europe. But yes, the big winners are the countries that produce abundant energy. Big shock. energy is life. If you make a lot of energy, you can control the destiny of a lot of people. And the US is an energy superpower. Canada is an energy superpower. The rest of the Western Hemisphere might be once Trump's done with his agenda. China is only in the race because of its massive coal stockpiles, but it is proactively and very, very, with great urgency, trying to develop homegrown oil, homegrown natural gas, build out a nuclear reactor fleet, become energy self-sufficient, but it has a big hole that it needs to fill. And so, yeah, that's pretty straightforward. If you produce a ton of energy, you tend to have, well, look, I mean, Saudi Arabia is paved in gold. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is an energy superpower. Europe consumes 38 exajoules of hydrocarbons a year and only produces 5. You tell me, where would you rather be? As an abundant energy producer or as a flaccid energy vassal like Europe? So that's the trend. That's what physics dictates.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the whole of the Europe is, but I know the UK actually uses less energy now than they used in 2008, which isn't it's potentially a good indicator of why there's been economic stagnation over the past.
Look, it's also one of the reasons why immigration is unpopular. If you're shrinking your energy supply and you're adding more people, to the denominator, then the marginal person, gets less. There's all kinds of other reasons why people don't like immigration, but that's not really what we write about. But yeah, the UK is in terminal decline, and you could tie it directly back to Ed Miliband and people like him who have utterly destroyed heavy industry in Great Britain. It's just undeniable that has occurred. The numbers show it, and it's just they've been left behind. The British people have been left behind.
Yep, and the Tories did a good job of that before.
Well, they're the same party. I mean, that's the same party. This is like it's one of the things that we laugh at is when people think that there's a Republican Party in Washington D.C. that supports Trump. Now, there's 80% of Congress is a uni-party. There's no real difference between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, and there's a smattering of people on the extreme left and a smattering of people who are truly sort of what you would call mega members of Congress, but 80% of Congress is the same party, and that's true in Britain as well. I mean, Labour and Tories, that's the same London uniparty. They're interchangeable. There's no major policy differences between Keir Starmer and his successor, or potentially even whoever might take his place here relatively soon. So we'll see. It's going to be an interesting week or two in Great Britain for sure. We're watching Rachel Reeves and her fall budget will be, we think, quite an important event that could also shape the future of Great Britain as well.
Yeah, and we saw some immigration news today, so it's interesting how it's all shaping up. And then, yeah, just have to see what happens. But Doomberg, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Sort of covered so much. But my last question is, what is one message you want people to take away from the conversation?
Yeah, just that the long-term real price of all commodities is lower, and don't fall for people who are out there thinking that the sky is falling, ironically, but yeah, that's the key message. If you have to invest in energy or commodities, invest in companies that are leveraged to volume, not price, and you'll do much better. But by and large, there's lots of oil in the world, there's lots of gas in the world, and there's only going to be more of it as technology evolves.
Yep, great message. So thanks again. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work and what you do, where would the best place for that be?
Yeah, our primary work, Doomberg.com, where you'll find our energy, finance, geopolitics stuff. And we have a second project that we've launched in September called Classics Read Aloud. You can find that on the Doomberg homepage or going directly to classicsreadaloud.substack.com. Fun, fantastic new project. Very high quality look at some really great classics from 100 years ago or more. And as the tagline for Classics Read Aloud likes to say, you're never too young or too old to enjoy being read to. So go check that out. Anthony, can't wait to see you as a subscriber.
Yeah, definitely. I'll check that one out. But thanks again for your time.
See ya.